Hey,
No, Jack, Dore needs to.
I did.
Okay, Jack, you're on.
thank you. Welcome, everybody.
Elaine and Sandra need to hide themselves.
Okay, that's usually done.
Elaine, you need to hide yourself, and David, you need to hide yourself for the moment.
Okay,
You just click, David, on the little camera icon that says start.
I have to do something here?
On the
What am I-
bottom where it says video, you see the video camera on the bottom next to the mute thing.
What should I do with it?
If you click on it, you'll go off. And then if you click on it again, you'll go on.
I should go off? All right. I clicked on it and there, it's off, all right. It's still off? Okay, now it's off.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. After this very smooth start of non-technical snafus, for those of you that may not yet know, my name is Jack Samet. I'm the president of Plato. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the February 2021 issue presentation of Colloquium. We're about to come full circle because our speaker, who you will be introduced to in a moment, winds up having been the last live speaker at a colloquium at Plato before the pandemic began. So we're, in a sense, we're coming full circle, though his topic and subject matter is quite different. I have three brief announcements to make. First, it is probably the best way to describe it is it's vaccination season at Plato, and many Plato members are involved in the vaccination process at various stage or another, either arranging for the first one, arranging for the second one, deciding whether or not to take it, or in some cases having already taken it, both first and second. In any event, we just want to apprise you all, I already did this, but maybe not everybody's aware of it. David Roloff has an excellent email cycle going around that outgrew from one of his TGIF sessions about the coronavirus. And in it, in that cycle, on an informal basis, Plato members are describing their various experiences with the vaccination process, where it's working well, where it's not, and so on. It's kind of like a gossip sharing center for vaccination events. So for those of you that are not in it yet, there are about over 70 people in it. It's a pretty good representation of a cross-section of Plato. For those of you that want to join it, just send Dave an email, David Roloff, and he'll put you on it, and you'll get to join the gossip circle. It actually is really a useful information circle about vaccination information. Second season that we're in is the preferential ballot season. The preferential ballot was just published a few days ago. It will be available until February 26th when it gets taken down. These are the courses to be selected for the September trimester, September 2021. I do want to commend the curriculum committee, and particularly the chairpersons, Ed Robin and Ken Corman. They did a fabulous job, and the whole committee did, and the people who submitted proposals did. I think this is one of the best cross sections of proposals I've seen. An excellent selection, and I think you'll all enjoy it and have a difficult time making the choices. So please remember to make your choices and register, or actually fill out the ballot before February 26th. Lastly, the third season we're in is the Plato political season, to the extent Plato has a political season, and that is between February and April. In February, the nominating committee for Plato was established, and between now and between their establishment and the first meeting of the board in April is when the nominating committee proceeds to discuss and determine and make nominations for officers and committee heads for next year. They deal with the 15 board elected positions. The rest of the positions are sort of appointed, if you will, subject to board approval by the president. As many of you probably already know, the president-elect for next year will be Barbara Klein, and that position is already set. But all of the other positions on the board are open, and the chairperson of the nominating committee is Diane Hantos. If any of you have any suggestions for nominations for any of the positions on the board, any of the major committee chairpersons, don't hesitate to contact Diane Hantos. And with that, I'd like to turn the matter over to our guest host. As you know, Hank Zangwell, the chairman of Colloquium, is our regular host. He's not available today. And Jay, who was a previous chairman of Colloquium and has done an excellent job, has agreed to fill in for him. So Jay, look forward to your introduction of our speaker for today. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you all for coming. Hank couldn't be here today. We have a real treat today, as we did last February 20th. David Bennett is the Meredith Professor of History Emeritus at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, where he's taught for more than 50 years, which explains my virtual Zoom background, which is the Finger Lakes region of New York, not very far from where Professor Bennett is coming to us today, although it looks a little different today because it's covered in snow. Professor Bennett specializes in and has written extensively about 20th century American history and political extremism in America. And you may remember his February 20th talk, which if you didn't see it, you definitely should go back on the Plato website and look at it again. From last year was about nativism in American history. Professor Bennett had received the Chancellor's Citation for Exceptional Economic Achievement at Syracuse. He was named Scholar Teacher of the Year. And he's been named the Laura and Douglas Meredith Professor for Teaching Excellence at Syracuse over the years. Today we're very happy to hear him talk about American democracy in distress, and he'll be discussing the Trump voter base, its origins and impact. And so after that, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A page, not the chat page. The Q&A page can be found at the bottom of your Zoom picture box where the little icons are, and you'll see Q&A, and you can just type in your question. And after Professor Bennett speaks, we'll have time. I will put some of those questions to him. So thank you, and I'd like now to welcome Professor Bennett.
Are we on? Yeah. Is that good? Okay. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate that. And I appreciate being invited back to Plato. It was a pleasure to be with you last year when we were out in Los Angeles at the Skirball Auditorium. It's been a few weeks now into the presidency of Joseph R. Biden, and only a few days from the second impeachment of Donald J. Trump. This is a bizarre moment in American history. None of us will forget the events of January 6th. The enormous crowd that gathered on the ellipse called there by Donald J. Trump for a Stop the Steal rally, as he put it. We won't forget his raging incendiary speech. We won't forget the crowd. Was it 8,000, 10,000, moving toward the Capitol, breaking through the police lines, thousands of them, the steps of the West approach to the Capitol. And we will not forget their breaking into the Capitol itself. We won't forget the scenes we had of the trashed offices, of the insurrectionists inside the House chamber. We won't forget the shouts, the urination on the floor, the scattered papers. We won't forget their cries. Trump sent us here, one of them said. It's 1776. We won't forget their flags, the neo-Nazi banner, the Trump 2020 flag, the Confederate flag marched through the great rotunda of the Capitol of the United States in 2021, and the flag that said, "Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president." Donald Trump was decisively defeated in election 2020, as we all know. He lost by over 7 million votes, 7.1 million votes, and 82 votes in the Electoral College. but 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. And now, many of them were not members of what became known as the Trump base. They were traditional conservative Republicans, and they almost always voted, many of them, for a Republican. They believed, as many conservatives have always believed, in small government and states' rights and federalism. Other people might have voted for Donald Trump because they were 401k voters, as somebody said. They liked the fact that the stock market had gone up, or they were single issue voters. But many of them, millions of them, were members of the Trump base. The Trump base, some of them we know are those red-hatted, MAGA-hatted wearing people who came to his immense rallies. There has been a huge literature, of course, already about Donald Trump, and there will be thousands of books, tens of thousands of books and articles about Donald Trump and about his administration and about what happened this year. Scores of them are already in the pipeline, and there have been works about the Trump base as well, about what it does and who might be in it right now. But there are very few people who have written very much about the origins of the Trump base. And because you were kind enough to ask me to come back, and as Jay pointed out, I am a historian by and that's what I do. I thought it might be helpful if I use this occasion to look at the origins of the Trump base and also of the way in which Donald Trump became the dominant force in his political party, how this individual had become so powerful that an entire political party owed fealty to him. How did it happen? That's really the question. How is it possible that so many millions of Americans would still believe that Donald J. Trump was reelected president and Joseph R. Biden's presidency was fraudulent and that the presidency was stolen long after it had happened? How is that possible after over 60 lawsuits by Trump's clown car of incompetent lawyers were laughed out of court, many of them by Trump-appointed judges? How is it possible after in state after state and local officials, many of them appointed by Republicans, certified the election? How is it possible after the head of cybersecurity, a Trump appointee, said that this was a remarkably free and fair election? How is it possible for people to still believe that? How is it possible, really? After the January 6th event in the Capitol, according to one poll 6 days later, that 50% of people who had voted for Donald Trump believed that he was not strong enough in contesting the stolen election, and that within the last week, 65 or 70%, depending on the poll you look at, of Trump supporters believe that this was a stolen election and that he was the legitimate president of the United States. And how is it possible that his supporters on Capitol Hill, even the night of the disaster on January 6th, gathered there after the rioters were cleared out of the House chamber and voted 147 of them, including 7 senators, to overturn the election, voting to disenfranchise the people who had voted for those in those states for their electoral college votes? How is that possible? How is it possible that the Republican Party has become a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump? We could argue, I suppose, that some of the people in Congress who voted that way were simply dull-witted or delusional. And some people have suggested that some of them are cynics. We know who a few of them are, people who believe that if they appeal to the angry base, that they might be positioned as presidential candidates themselves sometime. But some of them were simply terrified. They believe that if they voted against Donald Trump, he would vilify them on social media, and that his devoted base would be infuriated, and they would be primaried, and they would lose their nomination, they would lose their seat, and they would lose their political career. One former leader of the Republican Party said that his party had become a party of a few people who certainly didn't share these views, all too few, but a few cynics, a large numbers of crackpots, and even a larger number of cowards. If that was true, how did that happen? These are questions I think that we should examine. So let's begin by looking at the origins of the Trump base. And to do so, I think we have to go back just briefly to some of the material that we were looking at a year ago when I was out in California and met with some of you who were gracious hosts at Skirball. And that is to look at Donald Trump as a divider and not a unifier. The first president in modern memory who would not at least give lip service to the vision of the United States as the world's preeminent example of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, the nation of immigrants. Donald Trump never did that because he was a nativist. He believed, as nativists tend to, that minority peoples in the United States are like the alien other, and they are a threat to the dominant white Christian population. He had been a nativist really almost all of his life, and this is one of the reasons why we found such problems in dealing with the Trump base. At his rallies, it takes, in a certain sense, an immense amount of historical amnesia for many of the people there wearing those red hats to accept his rhetoric, in which he talks about Mexicans who are rapists and murderers, Muslims who are terrorists, Africans who come from shithole countries, as he embraces this historic tribal anger and hatred, to accept that without recognizing that many of their forebears were victims of the same kind of hostility. Nativism is as old as America. Many of those people at his rallies are Irish, Italian, Southeastern European Catholic, Southeastern European American Catholics. And Catholicism, as we talked about last time, was a deep-seated hatred in the United States, anti-Catholicism. And that in Massachusetts Bay Colony in the colonial period, the way kids learned the alphabet was through rhymed couplets. A, abhor that errant whore of Rome and all her blasphemies. How the Puritan divines in Massachusetts Bay talked about the Pope who has deluged the earth with the blood of Christians and is the most despicable monster the earth has ever had upon it. After the revolution, when there was a wave of Irish Catholics coming to the United States, fleeing the famine, they were considered to be sick, drunk, and dangerous outsiders, come here to steal American jobs, come here bearing fealty to a foreign dictator, the Pope in Rome. In the 1840s, there were pitched battles between Irish and Americans, as they called themselves, in the streets of eastern seaboard cities. In the 1850s, there was the organization of the Know Nothing Party, a really powerful nativist organization, the second political party in the United States. And it was called as it was because its formal name was the American Party, but its leaders were so convinced that there was a cabal, a secret cabal of Jesuitical conspirators who were trying to infiltrate it and undermine it, that they told their leaders, their members that, if you're asked about this, you should say, I know nothing. And after the revolution, where there was the wave of great Southern and Eastern immigration from that part of Europe, there was a proliferation of nativist parties. And the largest of them, the American Protective Association, wrote this way about Italian and Slavic immigrants. They're the most filthy, vicious, ignorant, and degraded paupers with an admixture of the criminal element. Nativism is as old as America. And the Great Seal of the United States, we have e pluribus unum, out of many one, but many Americans have never accepted that. It's very hard to live in a multicultural society, and people understood that. Trump understood it. Donald Trump himself, in his raging speeches, would attack immigrants. And he had at his side a fanatic anti-immigrant xenophobe named Stephen Miller, the man most responsible for putting those Central American and Mexican kids in cages on the southern border. Alone among almost all modern presidents in American history, Trump embraced this kind of nasty, hostile, nativist view. And there were large numbers of nativists who responded to him. And they become an element in the building block of what became known as the Trump base. But there were many other tragic dissonances in American life. And if you're going to look at who became Trump supporters, you have to look at these folks as well. So let's turn back to the 1960s in America, when the civil rights bills were passed, and they became the Civil Rights Acts in 1964 and 1965. And what they did was to create an enormous upheaval in the South and create a world in which many frustrated, angry white Southerners who responded angrily against what they thought were the Democratic Party of Lyndon Johnson, who was responsible for those bills. And just as Johnson predicted, when he signed the bills, there was a great political upheaval. The solid Democratic South became the solid Republican South. And soon, not only did congressmen, senators, but also state legislators and governors switch from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And now the Republican Party had racial resentment and racial hostility as part of its brief, and it had to address the problem of white grievance. One of the key figures at that time, as we probably recall, was George Wallace. But I'm not speaking about the George Wallace of Selma, or the man who stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. He was a very complex figure, and he understood how class tensions linked to racial tensions. When he ran for president and as an independent in 1968, he did appeal to racist views in the South and also in the North, but he linked them in the North to class resentments. When he was speaking to, for example, in New England, to Southern, Northern workers, he said the elites want you people, you Irish Catholics living in South Boston, to integrate the public schools with those inner city kids. But those elites, they're living in the leafy suburbs. They can send their kids to their fancy all-white schools. But it wasn't only race. He also talked about the elites' college-age kids who were burning their draft cards on their expensive campuses. But your kids, he said, have to go fight on the Mekong River or at Khe Sanh. And look at the parents of those children. What were they doing? They were the supporters of the Civil Rights Act. But more than that, they were supporters of the women's movement. They were the supporters of the gay rights activism. They were supporters abortion rights. They were supporters of immigration reform. They were even supporters of humanistic psychology, of psychedelic drugs, of the sexual revolution. What does that have to do with white working class people and their traditional family values that they had inherited from the 1950s? He said, you know, your party, the Democratic Party, has abandoned you. It's become the party of the liberal elites and the welfare constituency. It's not surprising that in the summer of 1968, during that election, he was polling 38 to 40% of industrial workers and their families in Illinois and Michigan. This was done. This was the appeal of George Wallace in that period. Now, in the 1970s, Richard Nixon and his team tried to appeal to what they thought might be a Wallace-like argument. They created what they called the Southern Strategy. But this effort to try to encourage more and more white working class families to abandon the Roosevelt coalition, where they had always been Democrats ever since the 1930s, and join the Republican Party, wasn't all that successful. What was really successful was the Arab-Israeli War, which led to the oil boycott, which led to the collapse of the auto and steel industries, which led to the stagflation which crossed across America. Later on, we recall in 2016, people arguing, you know, the reason why Donald Trump won the election was he was able to win those critical borderland states in the upper Midwest because of the World Trade Organization, or because of the threat of industrialization in China. And that's why they turned away from the Democratic Party. But in fact, we know that was not true. It was in the 1970s that there was the rise of the Rust Belt. That's when there was the collapse of manufacturing in that area. That's when there was the decline of those cities, of Detroit, of Akron, of Dayton, of Toledo, of Cleveland, of Buffalo, of Scranton, of Rochester and Syracuse, where I'm sitting right today. It's true that in the 1970s, The Economist had on its cover a symbol of Japan, the rising sun. And they said, this is the end of the American century. And they were wrong about that. America's economy would recover, but manufacturing would not recover, not the same way. And it was in an almost, if not terminal decline, a clear decline from that time forward. And because it was, a lot of the white working class people who'd been attracted by that argument that Wallace had first placed abandoned the Democrats. They're the people who embraced the social upheavals of the 1960s, which undermined your traditional family values. Now they were facing real economic distress. And it was now finally that many of them would abandon the Roosevelt coalition and would turn to the Republican Party, where they became known, as some of us know the phrase, as Reagan Democrats. Now, with Ronald Reagan in office in the 1980s, there were a lot of things that were happening. Among other things, the Federal Communication Commission ruled that it was no longer necessary for religious broadcasting to be nonprofit, that you could make a profit from it. And when they did that, they stimulated an enormous wave of television televangelists, as they were called. They soon built huge media empires. They had millions of people listening to their weekly sermons, and they made millions. You remember who they were. They were Jimmy Swaggart, they were Jerry Falwell, they were They were Pat Robertson and others. But they mixed their sermons with hard political commentary. They were opposed to abortion. They were opposed to gay rights. They were opposed to the sexual revolution. They were opposed, what did Jimmy Swaggart call it? The filth of hell running rampant across the nation. And Ronald Reagan said, I endorse you, he said to the televangelist. He said, I know you can't endorse me because you're people of the cloth, but he got that totally wrong. They totally endorsed him. They did it on television. Of course they endorsed him, because the Republican Party was now the party of traditional family values. And the new religious right became an important part of that. And we recalled what happened after that. The proliferation of evangelical megachurches began to blossom across the United States. And one of Pat Robertson's associates argued that he could engage in pew registration to help to turn all these new passionate parishioners into people who would become part of the Republican Party. And even as that was happening with these religious passions, one other development was occurring. And that happened to be with the National Rifle Association at this very same time. It was, what did they call it in the NRA? The Revolt of Cincinnati in 1977, when the National Rifle Association, which was always a modest and moderate organization of hunters and shooters, was suddenly captured by a coup. A group of extremists took it over. And after a while, they completed their capture of the organization and totally radicalized it into a powerful gun lobby, which argued that any effort of any kind to restrict gun rights on any weapons by anyone of any age would be unconstitutional. And they became strong supporters of the Republican Party, which would endorse them. And they said that they were going to punish anyone other than the Republicans who tried to endorse anything like gun safety measures. So where are we? We're with a Republican Party, which is and still assimilating its white Southern base of people who still harbor racial resentments. It's still trying to assimilate its base of Reagan Democrats, white, northern, industrial, working class, men and their families, angry at the Democrats because of their social programs and the social upheavals, and also because of the collapse of the economy. But they also now have to integrate the new religious right, the evangelicals with their own social agenda, and the one issue gun lobby people. And of course, among all those people, there's vast numbers of people who are by instinct nativist, who are fearful of alien immigrants. And they've always been there. And they're now even angrier because of the immigration reform acts that had happened in the late 1960s. And you put it all together, and what do you get? You get a witch's brew of angry, radicalized American groups who have deep-seated grievances. And they're looking for a political leadership which will speak to their resentments and their grievances. They are the people who will become the leaders of the Republican Party and its congressional leadership at the time. So let's turn to them. The Republican Party in this period is going through a change. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is president. He's the first truly conservative figure we've had in the White House since 1932. he says he's going to get the government off our backs and out of our pockets, by which he means that he's going to argue for deregulation of business and for tax cuts for the successful rich. But he also, his larger message is fear and contempt for government. You remember his famous 10 most fearful words: I'm from the government, I'm here to help. This message that Reagan had was borrowed by Trump later when he got to the White House and said he was going to deal with the faceless bureaucrats, clear out the swamp in Washington. And later he even talked about a sinister group of deep state operatives in cabinet positions. But long before Donald Trump began to use that argument, his predecessors in the White House, his Republican predecessors, were making a related argument. They were saying to this new base of angry constituencies, if you don't vote for us, Donald Trump, who's talked, or Ronald Reagan, who's talked about a fearful, powerful federal government, Ronald Reagan's federal government, this evil federal government, is going to impose its will on you. It's going to give you unrestricted immigration, abortion on demand, draconian gun laws. It's going to give you affirmative action. You've got to vote for us. In the 1990s, there was a change. We had Bill Clinton becoming president, and Clinton was a once-in-a-generation political talent. And after a rough couple of years, he became increasingly successful and popular. He couldn't find a working agenda in Congress. There wasn't a working majority for his Great Society-like agenda. That wasn't possible. But he'd find a third way to move forward with a reform agenda. And he was increasingly popular in 1996 when he won overwhelmingly. He said, I could have won even better if it wasn't for a lot of people who were responding to God, gays, and guns. But he was popular enough that a lot of Republican people on Capitol Hill recognized that he was a clear and present danger to the Republican dominance which had been in place for over a quarter of a century. He had to be destroyed, and they turned to a kind of ugly and intransigent opposition. And the key figure there was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And even before he became Speaker, he was willing to put together a videotape that he said would tell Republican candidates for Congress how they could demonize the opposition, how they could use nasty partisan rhetoric about it. Here, he said, is the words that you should use about your opponents. Call them traitors, thieves, cheaters. Call them socialists, call them communists, call them hypocrites, call them bureaucrats. Don't talk to Democrats. You can't do that. Don't have a drink with them. Don't have dinner with them. They're the enemy. Politics is a moral struggle. One side or another has to win. You can't compromise with these people. Newt Gingrich made it very clear. Compromise is capitulation. Newt Gingrich was the most poisonous figure in modern American legislative history. He's probably the most poisonous figure in all of American history, although I don't know if that's a position that most historians would share. But he was followed by other hard, hostile, and obdurate figures. The people whose names are forgotten now, the Tom DeLays, the Bill Archers. And they would be followed by a younger group of people. Three of them wrote a book called The Young Guns. One of the authors, we know his name well, that was Kevin McCarthy, now the Speaker the minority leader of the House. He would like to be Speaker of the House. And McCarthy places on the dust jacket of the book, this is not your grandfather's Republican Party. They were ideologues. They were responding to this new group of angry constituencies. And they believed in no capitulation and they believed in no compromise. And soon there would be more of them. When the Tea Party movement emerged after the economic collapse of 2009, as we remember, large numbers of moderate Democrats, or moderate Republicans, either because they were going to be primaried or because they had had enough, left Congress, and they were replaced by a new wave of people who were neophytes politically. They didn't know much about politics, but they did know that they hated Democrats and they disliked government. They created in the House of Representatives, the Freedom Caucus. We know who some of those members are. Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise, Mark Meadows was chief of staff for Donald Trump. And then, of course, there was Senator Ron Johnson. Ah, yes, Senator Ron Johnson. In 2012, I'm still remembering the century I was born in. In 2012, two very smart political scientists who were working in think tanks and at Brookings and at AEI, Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein, published a book called It's Even Worse Than It's Think. And here's what they wrote. One of the political parties in the United States has become an insurgent outlier. It's ideologically extreme. It's scornful of color. It's unpersuaded by the general understanding of facts, evidence, and science, and it is dismissive of the very concept of the legitimacy of its opposition. They quoted a guy named Michael Lofgren, who was a friend of theirs, who was a famous Republican staffer for many years on Capitol Hill, who had just quit the party. He hadn't quit the party, but he left the party on Capitol Hill. He said, I can't deal with my party anymore. It's no longer a traditional political party in a democratic society. It's a bunch of, well, he says it's a people who are a bunch of apocalyptic outsiders. That was the Republican Party that Donald Trump inherited. And that was the shaping of the political base for the Republican Party, which would serve the larger following, the real base of the party. But there's one more element in the story if we want to talk about the historical origins, and that is the creation of the great ecosystem for the party. I'll do that, and then I was going to talk a little bit more about Trump coming to power, but I'll probably stop at that point because we'll be reaching that time. You'll tell us when we have to stop. But let me say a few words about the ecosystem. It started with Rush Limbaugh, as we all know, who passed away yesterday. But Rush Limbaugh took advantage of an FCC ruling in 1987 during the Reagan administration, which said that you didn't have to have balanced programming. Rush Limbaugh was a disc jockey. He had become a commentator. And now, after the FCC ruling in 1988, he became the first right-wing ideologue on talk radio. And he was terrific. He used AM radio. Most people were not listening to AM radio, and most news broadcasts were appealing oftentimes to college-educated folks interested in the news, but he found a vast underserved audience. These were working-class men, for the most part, driving to work. And he told them, as they were behind the wheel, he said, you know, those Democratic elites have sold you out, and they're feathering their own nest at your expense. They've taken you for a ride, he said to them as they were grasping their wheel on the way to work. It was dynamite. And what he said was that the Republicans, in name only, the rhinos, are almost as worse. as bad as they were. So he was a very effective speaker, and he got only better as the years went by. And that audience of white working class people became his devoted followers, and they wrote in saying, keep on talking saying what you're saying. And after a while, he said, well, you're my ditto heads. And they embraced the term. The ditto heads became an audience of 15 million by this last year. And he was so successful that he had emulators on talk radio. Glenn Beck claimed he had 10.5 million followers last year. And Mark Levin said he had 11 million. And it wasn't long before television would come calling. And it would be, of course, a veteran Republican right-wing ideologue who was a veteran Republican political operative named Roger Ailes, who would team up with a medium-bearing Rupert Murdoch, and they would create Fox News. The Fox News profit center became the three pundits in their evening shows, as we all know. And after a couple of changes early in the years, they became the three we all know now: Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and Sean Hannity. And they became great supporters of Donald Trump as president. They not only embraced his views, they helped to shape his views because they were in constant contact with him. They endorsed his lies. They endorsed his conspiracy theories. They brought on their program Trumplican, the most vociferous Trumplican members of the House and the Senate. And that's what they did. But if you listen to Fox News, you'll realize very soon that that's what wasn't the heart of it. It wasn't their support of Donald Trump. It was the attack of the Democrats and on liberals itself, on the liberal media. It was skewering the libs that was at the heart of Fox News. And for people who are interested in spokespeople who understood the nature of white grievance, if people who are interested in those who would deal with their politics of angry resentment, listening to the pundits on the evening news for Fox was critical. It was almost like a drug. In fact, one journalist was told by some people at Fox News, "We don't have an audience, we have addicts." And for many millions of Americans, it became Rush in the afternoon, because that's where he moved, and the Fox Trio at night. Now we know that behind all this was a deep sense of cultural anxiety and an anger at the elites, and a belief by the part of many of Trump's followers that the elites, with their snarky comedians, with their fancy degrees, with their self-righteous sense of being on the right side of history, had contempt for them. And they believe, whether rightly or wrongly, that the elites, the faculty at universities, the people at the big newspapers in New York and Washington, the lawyers, the Hollywood and the Silicon Valley celebrities, some of the people on Wall Street, a lot of those people had contempt for Donald Trump and for his base and for them, and believed that they were dummies and bigots. And whether that was true or not, they believed that, and they felt that that was intolerable. They were the enemy, and they were desperate for Trump and his ecosystem to give them retribution. So it was all in place. That ecosystem on the radio and on television, all you really needed was the internet. And the internet, of course, gave us first Alex Jones with his numerous vile conspiracy theories. And he was a great Trump supporter. Trump was on his program and it praised him. And soon there would be others, Breitbart, Reddit. There was There was 4chan and XChan and the Echo Times and Gateway Pundit and Parler and Live and Gab and a lot of sites that none of us know anything about from the fever swamps of the internet, where they appealed, some of them, to conspiracists, to militia movement people, and helped to organize the attack on the Capitol. And there were even people we've never even heard of, many of us, by Ben Shapiro, Dan Bongino, who became influencers, and they have audiences of 6 million every week for their attack on liberals and Democrats. There was a strong system, an ecosystem in place to support Donald Trump and all this new base and its congressional leaders who believed in no compromise and in no capitulation. And its ecosystem needed was someone who would be a spokesperson for the angry grievances of so many millions. They needed a candidate, and down the escalator of Trump Tower came that candidate. Now, Jay, I got to ask you, I could go on. I was going to talk a little bit about what Trump did and what happened, but are we at a point where we should stop? Let me ask you that. I guess can you all hear me out there?
Don't do anything, just wait.
Well, I've not been muted, so I'll continue on until somebody tells me maybe I've gone too far. Down the elevator. All right, we hear you. Okay, do you want me to continue or not? I guess I have to have an answer. I will for a moment or two until somebody else comes up on the screen.
Yes, please go on, David.
All right, I'll go on. All right, so down the escalator comes Donald Trump. Now, a lot of the smart people believe that Donald Trump couldn't possibly be a candidate, they said. Look at him. He's a serial liar. He's a malignant narcissist. He's a vicious bully. That's what the people who didn't like him said. Look at him. He's an ignoramus. He doesn't believe in global warming. He has embraced the notion that it's okay to have nuclear proliferation. He talks about his opponent and says that Hillary Clinton should be put in jail like some tin pot dictator. When he gives his speeches, he says nice things about autocrats and nasty things about Democratic leaders. And look at him. He's a man who even his primary opponents, who are Republicans, would say has no experience in business, and in business was a failure. As a matter of fact, he was, what is it that Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham called him? A cheat, a thief, a con man. In his career, I mean, he inherited an enormous wealth, of course, as in real estate, but he was a failed businessman. He went through 6 bankruptcies. What is it that he was called by David Remnick of the New Yorker, because he had notoriety in New York? He was called a semi-humorous buffoon because he was a self-advertiser, and he was a publicity hound who wanted to create an image of himself as a sexual athlete and a skyscraper builder, always being sued by somebody else. So, as Remnick pointed out, he was known universally as the Donald. Now, he might not have been a successful businessman, but NBC thought, well, he's famous. We can offer him the gig on a new reality show called The Apprentice, where it turns out he was terrifically successful. He might not have been a successful businessman, but he played one on television, and he was the master of the boardroom there. It was a perfect casting for the nasty narcissist who could make "You're Fired" must-see television for a certain audience. And so when he announced his presidential candidate, and a lot of the smart people didn't think he'd win, they were dead wrong. Of course he won. He was more famous than Marco Rubio or Cruz or Graham or all the others. And there were so many of them on the stage during the Republican debates, he didn't have to say much about his positions. All he had to do was make fun of them and use childish nicknames for them. And that made him must-see television. He was already famous. And he soared ahead in the primary races. And he won the primary races and he won the nomination. And there he was at the Republican convention, and he had to give an acceptance speech where you finally could see the dark autocratic nature of Donald Trump. He described America as a country that was in economic chaos, that had cities everywhere that were covered with crime. There was terrorists everywhere. And at the end of the speech, he said, "I alone can fix it." We probably remember that. And the knowledgeable people said after that, who would vote for such a Mussolini? But he had the nomination. Now, did he expect to win the election? His erstwhile lawyer says no. He thought of it as a massive branding opportunity for the Trump organization. But he was a terrific, riveting TV speaker, and his outrageous speeches were much more compelling than those of, say, Mitt Romney or John McCain, earlier Republicans. And so it was very close. Now, he probably would have lost at the end if it hadn't been for two of the October surprises, for James Comey reigniting the Hillary Clinton email episode, and for the Russian intelligence organization's troll wars on the internet. But he did win by a hair-thin margin in those blue wall states. And now he was president, and he had to give an inaugural address. And the inaugural address was similar to his speech to the convention. And it even had a name. It's known as the American Carnage speech. We remember what it was, and we remember what happened at the end of it. And there sat George W. Bush with Laura next to Bill and Hillary Clinton and Barack and Michelle Obama. And George W. Bush at the end of the speech hoarsely whispered so everyone could hear him, that, he said, was some weird shit. Now he's president of the United States. And all of those people who had demeaned him proved themselves wrong. He might have been an ignoramus. Maybe he was a thuggish dunce, but he was a superbly gifted demagogue. He was a master at stimulating outrage and at playing to resentments. And his a powerful base understood that what he said was legitimate because Donald Trump shared their feelings of outrage, because he thought that elites were always trying to demean him. And so he knew how incendiary was fear and hatred in stimulating his base. Other presidents have done other things on their inaugural address. They've talked of hope and change and unity and sacrifice and courage. But Donald Trump wasn't interested in unifying America. He was interested in what his base was interested in, and that was not unity. And he understood that for them, fear and rage was incendiary. Donald J. Trump was the first political leader who gave his followers the permission to embrace their grievances and their anger. And it was dynamite. When he was president of the United States, of course, he was someone who was the despair of his opponents. as president, he almost immediately violated all of the norms of democracy. And should we stop now, or should we one more? We know what he did as president. He violated all these democratic and constitutional norms. He ignored rulings and safeguards. He trashed all ethical standards, and he made a mockery out of the guardrails which protect America from a reckless president abusing his power. And for people who disliked him, it was a long and difficult 4 years. But in the end, of course, Donald Trump, who looked like he could get away with almost everything, according to his critics, ran into the pandemic. And it was the pandemic which would bring him down. Because in the end, with 4% of the population having 20% of the COVID deaths in the United States, enough Americans apparently would say to themselves, now if Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton or George H.W. Bush or Barack Obama was president, how many people would be dead? Is it 200,000? But there are 400,000 dead. Just how many Americans has this inept, incompetent bloviator got killed? It was the pandemic, which led to his defeat.
Thank you, David. I think we'll move to questions now. And thank you for that very provocative talk. We have a number of questions. And let's start with one from one of our members. Didn't Democrats question the legitimacy of Trump's election from the very first day of his administration, objected to the electoral results, claimed there was a Russian conspiracy, and continued on for several years along those lines? So is Trump the only one to question the legitimacy of an election? And how did that behavior impact the behavior of the Trump base?
Very interesting question. And it's true that and you can hear this on Fox all the time, that Trump supporters will argue that this is in fact what the Democrats are doing, what they've always done. That's not entirely true. The Hillary Clinton, for example, didn't contest the outcome of the election. Even presidents who might have well done that in a presidential candidate, I'm talking about Al Gore in 2000, or even Richard Nixon in 1960, they didn't do this. It was only Donald Trump, not only right after the election, but for weeks after the election, to continue to do that. That made him a one-off and very unusual. Did large numbers of Democrats feel that he shouldn't be president? Oh, there's no doubt about it. Was there hostile opposition to him from the very start? I think that there is true, but some of that was because of his actions almost from the start in his trashing of ethical standards and ignoring these guardrails, which always separated presidents from being reckless, or at least that's what the defenders would say. So I think that there is some truth to that argument, but it's somewhat different. If I was going to conclude, which I was, I would have said that the most of all of Donald Trump's sins, in the opinion of his critics, the most manifold of them was his lies, the 30,000 of them, which were accepted ultimately by his followers, which were created in part by his ecosystem, and which ultimately meant that large numbers of people in his base were involved in a self-enclosed misinformation bubble, and that democracy itself is put at risk when large numbers of people can't make a distinction between alternative facts and facts. And we wonder how long democracy would endure. The best of his critics, the ones who were so hostile at the beginning, were hostile, I think, largely because there was this torrent of lies and there was fear that Donald Trump, unlike people they might not have agreed with in the past, not unlike George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, was different in this way. And you didn't hear it back then.
Another question, what would have been an effective response by Democrats to the actual issues that excited the Trump base? As opposed to attacks.
Were actually issues in which there would have been real differences, and what kind of compromise you would have would be hard to see. The gun control people wanted moderate gun reform. They didn't want to take people's guns away from them. That's an illusion. It would be easy to have reasonable gun control, to do something about closing the gun show loophole as Bill Clinton did, or outlawing assault rifles. That was a way of moving in that direction. As far as immigration reform was concerned, many Republicans were in favor of that before. Marco Rubio was, George W. Bush was, but there was no give here on the other side. So I think that there were Democrats, perhaps not left liberal Democrats, who like to call themselves progressives, who were believing that the only way you can deal with this is by taking total control of the House and Senate and pushing through our agenda. There were many moderate liberal Democrats who were interested in reasonable alternatives that moderate Republicans would accept. But that was not to be.
Well, we have another question, picking up on what you just said. We have a question. The actual question is the end of the filibuster hacking the Supreme Court, destroying Fox News, going to save our democracy? That was the actual question. Like, I would change the question a little and say, to what extent was the progressive positions, the positions you're saying could be compromised or reasonable, presupposed moderate people on both sides? To what extent do you think the progressives in the Democratic Party have staked out positions that make it very hard for moderate Republicans, for example, to make any progress?
Well, I don't think the progressives in the Democratic Party run the Democratic Party. And that was pretty clear in the primary elections after South Carolina and after. Joe Biden's a moderate. He's a centrist liberal, as I am, actually. And my son, who helped to organize and is one of the leaders of something called Third Way, which is a center left think tank, is that way. A lot of progressives don't think highly of moderates, but they actually do run the party. And the party isn't run by people on Twitter. They're the most outspoken figures. And the people in Fox News like to say that AOC or the farthest out left liberals speak for the Democratic Party, but they actually don't. And so I think it's possible to reach out that way. You couldn't ask for a more moderate figure than the President of the United States now, Joe Biden. And he would like to, as he said, have a bipartisan policy, but a bipartisanship is only possible if you get people who are willing to come your way. What he is offering now is not a radical program, at least not in the opinion of a lot of formerly very conservative economists as well as liberal economists. So I don't share the assumption that that progressives are running the party and that it's hard to compromise with them.
Well, how does that play in with, this is another question, actually. They use the example of Pelosi and Schumer being hostile, obdurate leaders who won't compromise. But you could perhaps go back to Harry Reid as well. So to what extent do you feel there are Democrats in Congress that are guilty of dismissing the legitimacy of opposition or refusing to compromise?
You know, when Nancy Pelosi didn't want to move for a few weeks on the number that she had finally hit upon, which was $2 trillion for relief. This was when Trump was still president. And the Republicans were first talking about a trillion and then 600 million. You could say that she was not moving at all, although she had moved down from 3 trillion at that point. It's true, of course, that the leaders of the Democratic Party will play hardball as well, but there was a lot of movement there, I thought. I mean, from 3 billion to 3 trillion to 2 trillion. And then finally there was this agreement on 900 billion or whatever it was. But there, in order to compromise, somebody has to be around to compromise with. The House had passed that bill months before, and Mitch McConnell wouldn't do anything for month after month after month. So I don't necessarily want to suggest that the Democrats are not sometimes difficult to deal with. They certainly are. But there is the possibility of compromise if you're dealing with people who are relatively moderate. And it seems to me the people who are in the White House now and the people around him are relatively moderate, just like Barack was and just like Bill Clinton was. We haven't had a left liberal as a Democratic president in my lifetime, because certainly FDR wasn't that way. Franklin Roosevelt was considered by socialists and people on the left to be a sellout. So we really haven't had the extreme left take over. We keep hearing from Fox News analysts that, and some Republicans on the Hill, that these are socialists or communists. That's comical. They're really not. And if you compare them to people on the political left in Europe, for example, they would be
Or California.
Or California. So, I mean, maybe.
What are your predictions for the future of Democrats and Republicans?
Well, I don't know. I'm worried about the Republican Party. Some of the people that I read most now, who I like most, are Republicans. They're never Trumpers, some of them. They're the people I never used to agree with about the Iraq War, for example, or about military policy, or necessarily about healthcare policy. But people like Michael Gerson, who put the poetry in George W. Bush's speeches, David Frum, who was a brilliant speechwriter for Republicans, Jennifer Rubin, who was a conservative columnist, Max Boot, they're the most, I think, eloquent and articulate figures who are saying why they left the Republican Party was not because they disagreed with conservative views. It's because the Republican Party had been hijacked by people who didn't believe in democracy anymore. And whether or not the efforts by a lot of Republicans now to try to recapture their party from this Trumplican base happens or not, I don't know, but I certainly hope it does, because what America needs is a strong liberal party and a strong conservative party. And then we can have compromise. That's how the Constitution was written. One side or the other can't impose its will. You got to have compromise. But to do that, you got to have both parties willing to go one way or the other. At least that's my view.
So what do you think will happen with the Trump base and Trump supporters going forward? Do you think they will disperse? Do you think they'll divide? Do you think the different camps of the Republican Party will splinter off? And what do you think will happen with the Democrats and the progressive wing of the party?
Take the last one first. I think that the progressive wing of the party, we're going to hear them very shortly complaining bitterly that they're not getting their entire agenda through. But a lot of the people in the progressive wing of the party are now in positions of power. Bernie Sanders is the chairman of a major committee on the Hill, and AOC is now a major figure on the Hill. And they know, as we know, that the Democrats aren't in a position to try to drive anything through. All they have to do is lose the vote of one senator, and they can't get anything through the Senate. And they've got a tiny margin in the House. And if they don't look successful, the tradition is that they're going to lose both the House and the Senate majority in 2022, and then all bets are off for anything that any Democrat, left, right, or center might be interested in. So the Democratic Party is a party now where I think they'll be unified just because they know that in order to get anything through, they've got to persuade some conservative figures like Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kristen, how do you pronounce her last name, from Arizona, that senator, who to come along. As far as the Republicans,
Cinema.
Why don't I remember that? As far as the Republicans,
Another question: does the GOP need to get rid of the current leadership to bring back political dialogue? And I guess you could ask it both ways.
I certainly agree with that.
Does the GOP or do both parties need to get rid of current leadership to bring back political dialogue? I think you're muted.
Have I got muted?
No, you're okay now.
I don't think Democrats have to do that, because I don't think that the Democrats aren't. The Democrat leadership is not extreme. I mean, nobody ever considered Chuck Schumer an extremist, and while Fox News made Nancy Pelosi into a whipping girl, she's not really an extreme figure. Ask some of the progressives about her. But as far as the Republican Party is concerned, they certainly, if their leadership is going to be Kevin McCarthy and the people who voted twice now to let Donald Trump off the hook in those impeachment votes, it's going to be very difficult. And they still control the Republican Party. Within the last 2 weeks, Donald Trump, who doesn't believe he's a twice impeached, disgraced instigator of an insurrection, has said that if any Republicans try to cross him, he'll start his own party. He called it the Patriot Party, or maybe the MAGA Party. And as soon as he said that, Kevin McCarthy went down to Mar-a-Lago to see him and to essentially kiss his ring, because that would destroy the Republican Party. And so what he thinks he can do is either run for president himself, or he'll be the kingmaker and decide who will run in 2024. We don't know if that'll happen. We don't know if faced by the lawsuits he faced by, or if, as the weeks and months go by, if large numbers of Republicans will decide, maybe now that he's president again, we should rethink our devotion to him. But until and unless a large percentage of Republicans decide that he's not the leader of their party, it's going to be very difficult.
Is it to Democrats' advantage or the advantage of CNN or media to keep Trump in the news and keep him alive in order to try and bring that about and help Democrats?
Press conference or his town meeting, Joe Biden the other day, when asked about Trump, called him that other guy. The last guy. Probably infuriated Trump. I think it would be good for the Democratic Party and for the Republican Party for fewer people talking about Donald Trump. That's an interesting argument, using Trump as a person to mobilize support might be helpful to some Democrats, but certainly hope they don't do that.
Another question about the violence last summer. And I'll rephrase the question a little bit, but was the lack of a strong response in terms of law enforcement and prosecution to the violence last summer, and the lack of willingness of some Democratic office holders to condemn it, or in some cases their willingness to support what occurred last summer, including seizure of police stations, seizure of portions of Portland and Seattle. To what extent might that have emboldened right-wing extremists to think they could actually get away with storming the Capitol with no consequence? I'm losing you.
I don't know if that was on the minds of those folks, but I do agree that that what happened in Seattle and in Portland, maybe I'm not very woke, as they would say. I think that was outrageous, and it certainly allowed Fox News and a lot of people who were trying to undermine the massive demonstration for Black Lives Matter, which was very different than what was happening in Seattle and what was happening night after night in Portland. And some of that was being stimulated by people who were extremists who weren't interested in Black Lives Matter at all. But enough of it was linked to demonstrations that I think that what happened in Portland and Seattle was not only unfortunate, but it helped to stimulate the argument that Black Lives Matter was responsible for the looting that you saw in Philadelphia and Chicago and New York, which I don't think was true of the vast mass of demonstrators that time. But there was activity that could be used to support the notion that some of the people who were saying great things about Black Lives Matter should have also said, as Joe Biden ultimately did say, that anybody who engages in looting and that kind of violence should be in the criminal justice system.
I think we have, let me see, one more perhaps. So this could be the last question. Let me see if. Given the level of polarization, the role of the internet, and the many instances we can talk about of political figures kind of stretching the truth or being untruthful. And I'm talking now not just about Republicans. I'm talking about some of the things that occurred with Democrats as well. As well as the bias, not just with Fox News, but in other media organizations, including organizations such as CNN. What hope do you have that the current state of affairs will change?
It's hard for me to know without having the data how many people watch CNN and MSNBC and Fox News as a percentage of the total population. But it's true that CNN and MSNBC was all Fox all the time themselves, and their increasing hostility to him almost matched the hostility that you get from the pundit trio that in the evening on Fox about the Democrats. And what we have to hope now with Joe Biden as president, who is a moderate figure, and we know a lot about what he's doing because he's quite transparent. We have his press secretary having press conferences several times a week, and we have people working for him in key cabinet positions saying what they're doing all the time. We have to hope then that maybe we can return to a kind of normality that we saw in all the presidents before Donald Trump, during the age of Barack Obama and the two Bushes and Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan, when there was depolarizations and people didn't like people on the other side, but it wasn't this kind of hostility, not feeling that the other side were the enemy and you can't compromise at all. Hopefully we're going to be getting back to a more normal political discourse, but it's going to be difficult.
Last question. This looks like it's to Plato, so I'll answer it. Is this supposed to be a neutral and fair presentation, or is this one-sided? No, it is not supposed to be a neutral and fair presentation. It's supposed to be a provocative presentation, listening to the views of Professor Bennett, who's a very prominent historian and has a lot to say. You're certainly free to agree or disagree, and occasionally we'll have speakers that have different views, but it's more designed to make all of you think. It's not designed to present any views of Plato. These are not views of Plato or members of Plato or whatever. It's designed to have a civil discussion about issues that come up, and we do that with all our colloquia and try to do it in a way that will provoke you, sometimes even upset you, sometimes cause you to think, and provide further discussion post the colloquium among the members. So that's really what it's designed to do. So with that, Professor Bennett, thank you very much for coming again. And gracing us with your presence all the way from Syracuse. The next colloquium, I am not sure when it will be because I'm just standing in today temporarily for Hank. I assume it will be next month, and I do not know who the speaker was, but if you check your emails, you will see that. But thank you all for coming here and for participating. Thank you again. We hope that we will see you again live and in person as we did last time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I should leave now, right?
I guess we all